Please welcome your panelists for Global Risk, Disruption Without End, moderated by Bloomberg's Editor-in-Chief, John Micklethwait.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this panel, of which the title is indeed Global Risk, Disruption Without End. And we have a fantastic team of people to discuss this. I'll very quickly introduce them because there isn't a great need for long biographies in this case. At the far end, we have Mac Thornberry, who's the US representative for one of the seats in Texas, and more importantly, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the US House of Representatives. We then have Jane Harman, his former colleague, who was a Democratic Congresswoman, but is now the director, president, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Then we have Jim Stavridis, who is the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, but before that had a small job as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. Then we have Peter Mandelson, who's run just about everything in Britain, but is also a member of the House of Lords, and co-chairman, founder and co-chairman of Global Counsel. And finally, we have Carlos Gutierrez, who is the chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group, but was also US Secretary of Commerce. I think if you look at this title, Global Risk, Disruption Without End, I think the key part of it is that final element, because global risk is something that we've all known and has continued for a long time. But what is unusual about the present state of affairs is the idea that this seems to be something that is more ceaseless than was before, and that is something that, in a strange way, I think the markets are often unable to cope with. What happens at the moment, from a financial point of view, is that some kind of risk emerges, the markets panic for about a day, and then they realize they can't altogether understand it, and they move on. In my attempt to be somewhat military, I'll say Jim's honor, the way in which we were going to do this was I was going to ask each of them to talk a bit about one individual risk, somewhat briefly, and then we'll come to the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and ask Mac to give an idea of how Congress deals with this, and then we will go through the different ways in which governments are either helping or not helping, making these endless problems, and then ask some fairly fundamental problems about the nature of risk nowadays, whether something fundamental has changed or not. Anyway, I'm going to start with Jane and ask you perhaps maybe you can talk about the thing which is most in the news at the moment, which is the joys of the careers.
Well, I'm pleased to be back at this wonderful forum in my hometown and to provide a little gender balance to the panel. Yes. I have to start with a comment Tony Blair made at lunch about an hour ago, in case some of you missed it, but apparently President Moon of South Korea said today that President Trump deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, to which Blair said the Nobel Committee must be in therapy. And for now. I mean, maybe he will deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, but not so fast. Just in terms of global risk, the risks are huge. And some think that by agreeing to this new summit, we, the US, have already given it away for free. We give equality to a man who doesn't deserve equality. We may actually meet on the demilitarized zone, if you listen to President Trump today, which, in other words, means just next to or perhaps into his own country. But let me size it up this way. Both sides have enormous risks. The Kim dynasty, which has been in power for 70 years, this is the grandson, wants regime preservation. That's what they want most of all. So why would they give up their nuclear arsenal and also let the citizens of their country understand how much deprivation they've been through for 70 years? Both of those things seem like huge risks. Looking at the other side of it, the US, and I don't just think the US will be involved in this, I surely hope China, our allies, if we still have them after tomorrow, depending on the tariffs, and the region care very much how this goes. We have risks too. If we, in pursuit of this aspiration of denuclearization, were to give up our nuclear shield in the region or our troops in Korea, Those are huge risks. I don't think we'll do that. And let's not forget the naval fleet around in the area. So I think where this goes is very much uncertain. Talking is much better than bombing, so surely it is a good thing to start the process. And some of the early actions on both sides and the absence of name-calling are a great relief.
Jim, do you want to react a tiny bit to that, but maybe talk particularly about Russia, which I asked you to?
Sure. We've got a terrific audience here of people who are largely from the business world, so let's start with the fundamentals. Russia has a very bad hand of cards. Their population is declining. They have high rates of alcoholism, opioid abuse. Their economy is effectively a one-trick pony. John McCain once called it the largest gas station in the world. And their population is not only declining, it's extremely maldistributed. They're the largest country in the world, but 75% of the population lives in a small part of the country to the west of the Ural Mountains, which means there's this enormous tranche of Russia essentially empty except for huge hydrocarbons. China looks at that part of Russia the way a dog looks at a ribeye steak. It's a very attractive proposition. And so when you kind of put all that together and you add to it that they have 11,000 nuclear weapons, I worry less, John, about Russian strength than I do about Russian weakness, in the sense that they also have a leader, Vladimir Putin, who's a very clever tactician, but I think a flawed strategist. And over time, he will take risks that will push Russia in a direction that I think is going to be antithetical to the progress of Russia in really engaging with the world. I'll close by saying, increasingly, Russia looks like an angry island in the middle of the Eurasian Peninsula. That's not a good place for the world. We need to figure out a way, a modus vivendi, to work with them.
Is there a particular place where you think that Russia could make that sort of, where Putin could overreach?
I think, first of all, there's an accidental collision in Syria. That worries me a great deal. We have, both of us, thousands of troops, aircraft, and ships in a very small battle space. So you have to be wary of that accidental piece. And secondly, it is, to me, not inconceivable that the overreach would be a continuation of the operation in Ukraine and consolidating between Crimea, and here's a news flash, Crimea is never going to be part of Ukraine again. That potential overreach could spark a pretty dramatic confrontation. Let's hope we can avoid that.
Peter, do you want to...
I mean, we're far from sanguine about Russia in Europe. Russia is one sort of bookend, we're at the other, we share a continent, and we think that Putin is conducting policy like a protection racket.
Yes.
He goes around beating people up, inflicting real damage, causing problems and danger wherever he can, and then demands to be paid in order to stop doing that.
Precisely.
And we think he's more than a loose cannon. He's a man who combines despotism and great self-confidence and a growing skill in hybrid war. He's interfering in our elections across Europe. He's always backing the extremists, whether they're the right or the left, and the nationalists. Anyone who threatens European unity, he's right behind. So we are pretty worried about Russia.
And is there another angle on Europe that you're particularly...
Look, I think on Europe, we are emerging from a decade-long series of crises. I mean, literally almost, it seemed, without end. I mean, we had a rather bad global financial crisis and banking crisis, you might have noticed. We then converted that into a sovereign debt crisis, a political crisis within the EU and the Eurozone. We then had a refugee crisis. We've had major terrorist events, and then, God help us, we had Brexit. You know, sorry about that. Now, I would say that Europe is now emerging from that series of crises and is regaining its mojo, certainly in its economics, but I would say that below the surface there are real tensions and political differences which are boiling away. in Europe. We are worried about the health of the Atlantic alliance and worried what a misstep over the Iran deal will do to the transatlantic alliance. We are worried about how we should engage China in the best way. And as I said, we are worried about our neighbor in Russia. At the heart of it is repairing our politics, John, but that's something which affects the whole of the West. And unless and until we do that satisfactorily, we are going in the West to continue to be a danger to ourselves and therefore of less help to the rest of the world.
Carlos Gutierrez, Jane mentioned very quickly the words, when the trade war begins tomorrow. Perhaps you can give us your view on that, perhaps a little bit about China as well.
Yeah, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to be at the Milken Institute, and thank you, Jane, for that setup. You know, we've been talking a lot about trade wars and whether there will be a trade war, and one of the things we don't see in the front pages is that things are already happening on the ground. Permits are taking longer, contracts aren't being signed, acquisitions are being delayed, so it's already starting. Wars start with battles, and I think the battles are there. I'll say two things about China that worry me. One is the Chinese economy. And we're at a point where I feel they are at an inflection point. Debt that is 250% of GDP, extremely high if you look at it on a per capita basis, on the size of the economy. Most of that debt is state-owned enterprises. As you know, there's a model whereby the provincial governors get a budget, they're able to borrow, and they have a budget to create jobs and to bring in tax revenue. At the same time, what's happening in China today is there's a new almost branch of government called the supervisory branch that is looking out for corruption, second-guessing people. It's not good to keep a fluid system moving, growing, people making decisions. In addition to that, the One Belt, One Road is a tremendous financial commitment. So how do you continue to grow an economy at 6.8, 6.5% if you don't want to grow your debt or you can't grow your debt, knowing that a lot of what you've spent your money on is already behind in the GDP numbers, such as overbuilding in buildings, in residential areas, in steel plants, in automobile plants. At some point, that has to come to a reckoning. And when China grows at 4% instead of 6.5%, I think we're going to miss these days that has become so fashionable to regret that we allowed China to come into the WTO. The other part about China is we're in the middle of this almost a trade war where we have this 301 mechanism where we are going to apply tariffs on $50 billion coming in from China until they do something about their intellectual property rights violations and their technology transfer requirements for China 2025. The first one is pretty easy. It's tariffs. It's tactical. It's how much do you put on, how much do we put on. The second one challenges the Chinese system. And I personally do not think that we will be successful in that. I don't think we're going to change China. I don't think we're going to make China look like the US. And I do believe it is more and more a fool's errand. So what we may end up with is simply a recognition that in this world there are different, recognizable, acceptable political differences and different acceptable economic differences. And that's something that we have not wanted to acknowledge. But I feel like we're heading there.
Can I just pick up a thread from Secretary Gutierrez, which is an area of the world. It's the South China Sea. And to agreeing entirely with the Secretary's points, I think that over time, the potential for that to be a flashpoint, because China absolutely sees that as territorial seas of China. And over time, particularly as growth slows, and the Chinese leadership needs to find outlets, the potential for increased confrontation in that body of water, I think, is quite high.
Mac, in a sense, all these problems, Korea, Russia, dysfunctional Europe, China, trade, they all, in a sense, flow towards you. And I wondered if you could give us some idea how in Congress you think about this and evaluate it, and I suppose some element of what do you do about it.
I would say, number one, what you realize is we, as Henry Kissinger has testified, we live in a world with an unprecedented number of complex threats, so that it is impossible to predict exactly which one of them will manifest itself in serious ways at any particular time. The job of Congress, in addition to oversight, is to help provide the tools that the executive branch has to use to deal with these various situations. And in my area of the military specifically, the Constitution says it's Congress's job to raise and support, build, provide and maintain the military force of the United States. So just to take a brief historical example, as of 2 months ago, if you looked at our defense spending, it was 20% less than it was in 2010. So what happened in those 8 years? Well, Russia invaded Crimea, China started building islands in the South China Sea, ISIS came and nearly went, Iran has expanded its influence tremendously. I mean, the list goes on and on. So there's a lot of debate these days about the president's tweets and policies coming and going in different ways. What we cannot change with a tweet or turn off and on is the military capability that is available to a president or a secretary of defense. And so what strikes me is the thing Congress can do that matters the most is to make sure that we have the military capability to deal with everything from nuclear weapon states to disease breaking out in Africa, because we expect the military to handle all of those things, to have that wide range of capability and enough of it so that we can put more ships off the Korean Peninsula and make China nervous so that they can be more of a participant in finding a resolution, so that we can have enough military capability to try to keep the lid on Syria or the Middle East in general. We've got to have that military capability, or a president, however he comes and goes, will not have that available to him. Last point, I would say Putin and Xi watch more closely what we do rather than what we say. What they have to watch is, are we really being able to defend this country against missile attack? Do we really have the ships we need? Are we really putting the research into hypersonics and AI and the other technologies? What we do matters more than what we say.
Sounds like a very good argument for an increased military budget, but I think Jane Harman may disagree with some of your history.
Mac and I were elected to Congress in the same year, the vaunted year of 1992, also called the Year of the Woman, go figure. And we served on the Armed Services Committee together, and I generally agree that we have underfunded our military budget. I represented an aerospace-dependent part of Los Angeles in Congress for 9 terms, and certainly my view is Congress worked perfectly while we were both working together, and then I left and it fell apart. But Mac is right, and his leadership of the committee is strong, but there are a couple of missing parts, not that they're your fault. Part one, we need a strategy around how we build our military and deploy our military, and I think this is not just a criticism of the Trump administration. I don't think we had it in the Obama administration, and frankly, I don't think we had it in the Bush 43 administration. Since 9/11, we have lacked a real strategy that we can explain to the world about where we deploy and where we don't deploy, where we ask our allies to do the fighting, where we have a small footprint, where we just do train and equip, where we just use drones, etc. We don't have that, and it's crucial. The second part that we are missing is that, at least I think so, we don't have sustained American leadership. And that's a rant on all these administrations, but also on the partnership with Congress that we used to have. And that is missing. Congress is AWOL on a lot of these issues. The failure to pass a new authorization to use military force, I think, is a mistake. I'm sure you agree with me on that. And again, it's not your fault. But as we think about risk, we have to think about, do we, as the United States, have a better argument? Do we have better leadership? Not just are we playing whack-a-mole against the bad guys who are rising up against us.
And if I could just briefly respond, I think I will give the Trump administration credit because they have come up with a national security strategy, a national defense strategy that flows from it, and they are beginning, and I completely agree, strategies have generally been glossy documents that sit on a shelf and meant nothing. But the Trump administration is starting to look at how to write budgets that reflect that strategy. And what that means is more money going into peer competitors and less money doing some other things, and that will be controversial in Congress. But I think at least we see some folks trying to make sense of all of this complexity that we've been talking about, and we really haven't gotten into the Middle East and many other problems that are out there. I think it's a promising step.
I'll come to Carlos in a second. Jim Stavridis, you had to... You were on the tough line of this. Firstly, kind of whose version of history are you closest to? And then secondly, do you think that the Trump administration has got a kind of coherent policy now?
You know, I would say that the Trump administration, like all administrations, is getting some right and getting some wrong. I think they're getting it roughly right on Syria, measured strikes in response to chemical weapons. I think, however, they're getting it wrong when we hear the president say, we're just going to come home from Syria. That's unrealistic. So even within the framework of Syria, some of it's looking pretty good, some not so much. I think the biggest miss geostrategically was withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Here you see that nexus of trade, geopolitics, and to walk away from that and open that space for China was a big geopolitical mistake before we even get to the trade benefits of being in what would have been the largest trade union in effect in the world. So I think they're getting some of it right, some of it wrong. It'll be quite fascinating to see how this North Korea question plays out. And I think it will be a bellwether for the administration going forward.
Do you see a Nobel Prize coming?
I'm with Jane on this one. It's a little early to be ordering the Dom Perignon.
They gave one to Obama after he
I think our president has strengths and weaknesses like we all do. One of his weaknesses is he wants instant gratification. He thinks he's going to kind of slap the table, walk out, and fly to Stockholm and pick up the prize. To get this done right is the work of a year or two at a minimum. It can be done. I'd say the odds are better than even. It will be done in terms of an agreement, but I wouldn't bet on that Peace Prize quite yet.
Carlos and then Peter.
Yeah, I want to say something. I was supposed to talk about trade, but I'm going to get myself into the defense side here. But my understanding of our history is that after the Revolutionary War, we weren't ready for the War of 1812. We were surprised. We weren't ready for the Civil War. We weren't ready for World War I. Weren't ready for World War II, as we all know. And after that, we sure weren't ready for Korea. And it's almost as if though we behave as if the last war is always the last war. There's a number, and I don't know if it's below 4% of GDP. I know under President Clinton it got down to the low 3s, but there is a number whereby things should start flashing. And I think about the world today, there are a lot more potential hot spots than there may have been 20 years ago. So it would seem to me that we have to adjust. And I'm not a hawk, I'm just trying to be realistic.
But adding to that, does anyone remember the pivot to Asia? That was the big Obama. Yeah,
Trans-Pacific Partnership.
The thrust of it was, aside from repositioning some military forces and other assets, was a stronger economic relationship. And TPP was the centerpiece of that. And economic security is a piece of national security. And this was a way we were going to bolster our friends in the region and bolster them, I don't want to say against China, but to be better competitors with China. The other a couple more points. One, in the South China Sea, we are not signatories to the Law of the Sea Convention, which gives us the moral low ground in arguing how people should behave there. And finally, no one's mentioned Iran yet. On May 14th, the president has a big decision about whether to decertify the Iran deal. It may happen by then that 3 countries in Europe plus us agree to a side deal, which will be enough for him to stay in the Iran deal. But if I'm Kim Jong-un and I'm looking at the U.S. Walking away from one of our agreements that we just signed having to do with the nuclear capacity of another country, I might not bet my chips on a new deal with the United States. And I especially would not look at the experience of Libya as something in favor of giving up my nuclear arsenal. John Bolton today apparently said that that was a good example. I'm not sure how I compute that. I think we caught them red-handed. They gave up their nuclear arsenal, and a few years later, their leader was dead on the street, killed by his own people.
I think the chances of Kim Jong-un giving up the nuclear weapons are roughly the same as the chances that the Mexicans are going to pay for the wall.
Well, I can't, yes, I don't know whether the North Koreans are going to do this or not, although I hugely applaud the role of South Korea in stepping up and doing what they've done.
Agree.
I mean, it's fascinating to see both China and, to an extent, the United States, the big powers, having to sort of step back and allow South Korea to take center stage, and I welcome this. I think, by the way, the President's decision to withdraw from TPP is just about the most counterproductive thing that you could do for any strategy in Asia. It's essentially giving Asian trade on a plate to China. I don't see what purpose that serves. But can I just say this about Trump? I am not going to be head of the queue lining up to recommend President Trump for a Nobel Prize. And like many others, I worry about the sort of lack of coherent leadership he gives. I don't like the sort of not knowing where he's going to be and what position he's going to take, depending on which side of bed he gets out of in the morning. However, I say this may be a little counterintuitive coming from a sort of liberal, progressive European like me. Being unpredictable does have a flip side in international relations, and I think it has in the case possibly of North Korea and certainly of China. I think that when people don't know exactly how you're going to react, they just pause for thought and think twice before they take you for granted. And I think that in relation to China, although I don't like the sort of threatened sort of unilateralist trade measures and tariffs and sanctions that he's threatening, I certainly agree that we have a China trade problem. I speak as a former trade commissioner of the European Union. I went back the other day and was reading a speech I made in 2007, over 10 years ago, when I just got so fed up with China. I felt as if I was being led round the garden path, you know, by a string at the end of my nose. And I said, right, we're going to take European-China relations downhill. And I made a speech which contained a lot of language which seems remarkably similar to the sort of tone that President Trump is currently adopting. But I just say this: he's certainly caught China's attention, and I think that President Xi will be thinking twice and 3 times about where his industrial and trade policies go from here, because he's got in President Trump somebody who could really let rip.
Very quickly, Peter, can I just push you on one thing? I'm sure that the Congressman's too polite to say this, and Jane, famously polite figure, and Jim, but many people would look at the military problems they stretched out earlier and say the problem is that the Europeans don't pay, they don't do enough in this field.
Yeah, and I don't think there's good news on that on the way anytime soon, I'm sorry to say, and I fear this particularly about Britain. You know, Britain has always stepped up to the plate militarily.
Correct.
We've always been there with the United States, prepared, in a sensible way to use force as a last resort. One of the uncovenanted consequences of our leaving the European Union is, first of all, that we're giving up that multiplier for our foreign policy, which being a member of the European Union has given us. Now the European Union, the third biggest sort of power bloc in the world, will be taking decisions about their positions on international matters at meetings which Britain will no longer, as of right, be able to attend. Secondly, Britain has always had a disproportionate influence in international institutions which we played such a big part in creating and shaping after the Second World War. We are going to lose that foothold to an extent by our stepping back and out of the European Union. And thirdly, I believe that because of the squeeze that's going to come on our economy and our public expenditure over the next decade, as a result of our leaving the European Union, our military spending is going to be on a downward trajectory, and that worries me.
Yeah, somebody said the problem today is that the president is unpredictable. I wouldn't call him unpredictable. I think actually he's quite predictable.
He's predictably unpredictable.
Well, what he says is unpredictable. But
what he does.
We have to watch what he does. My concern is that if you know that someone is bluffing, they're really not bluffing you. And we have bluffed so much and so often that after a while you wonder if people believe it. I recall a conversation I had with President George W. Bush, and he said, this was 6 months ago, he said, I still think about why didn't Saddam believe me? And that's what haunts, these leaders, and I'm
because
sure
he got used to not believing what the West says, probably.
And so I think President Trump has to be extremely careful, to say the least, on is he bluffing, is he not, what does he do? He's made so many tremendous promises. The other thing I would say about TPP and strategy is Japan. I'm actually embarrassed by the way we have treated Prime Minister Abe. I know we have a trade deal and a situation going on, but he spent political capital getting the TPP, then he was left holding the bag. He took up on the leadership. He's pulling it forward, which is great for us because one day the U.S. will be able to join. And why not put everything together in a strategy and say, maybe right now is not a time to embarrass Prime Minister Abe, because chances are he's going to be out of office. Is that good for the U.S. that Prime Minister Abe be out of office? And there are many examples like that, but that's one I would pick.
The world needs more Japan, not less.
I also think there's a... did Matt want to talk?
I can ask you, Matt, can I ask you two questions very quickly? One, because they both come up. TPP, firstly, and then second is the idea of Trump's instability, or whatever word you want, contributing in being either a solution or contributing to global risk, how you saw those two. But then I also wanted to ask you whether this conversation has been delightful, but it's followed the normal thing that everyone in the end somehow blames the administration for some things. Do you think that the world is now fundamentally different to previous levels of risk that you've seen? Has the problem just got harder? Three questions, sorry.
Yeah. First, I agree on the TPP. It was, as Jim said, a geostrategic mistake as well as an economic mistake. And I would just say parenthetically, we've had a number of hearings, especially this year as we're focusing on China, where they don't just have a whole of government approach to advancing their interests, they have a whole of nation approach that includes the economic as well as cyber theft, as well as this whole range of things. We're not very good at that because we still tend to have government agencies in silos, and not only are we not good at thwarting their whole-of-nation approach, we're not very good at a whole-of-nation or whole-of-government advancing our interest. I do think there is a fundamental change in global risk, and a lot of it comes down to the word speed. It all moves so quickly. And that is one of the changes from how we have dealt with wars and conflicts in the past. We had time to gather ourselves up and adjust our industry and train our folks, and we don't have that anymore. We're literally, conflict can occur at the speed of light. But on the president, as I tried to mention at the beginning, you know, I'm more of the speak softly, carry a big stick school. But it may be that this unpredictability can pay dividends, say, in North Korea. But it only pays dividends if you know you have the military strength to back it up. If you know there's weakness behind you, then obviously President Xi or Kim Jong-un will discount what you say. So unpredictability only works if you have a strong stick available to you to employ when needed.
Jane, and then Jim.
A couple of points. Geopolitics is back, and I think we didn't notice until we were in a weakened position. And what I mean by that is, since 9/11, a lot of our doctrine was focused on terrorism, counterterrorism. And terrorism is a huge threat and a constantly evolving threat, but it's a tactic. It's not a country with a huge both bully pulpit and a military and a budget. It's not that. And in the meantime, as the U.S. has made several strategic mistakes, one, in my view, was Obama's mistake, the failure to bomb Syria after it crossed our red line on chemical weapons. But going back to George W. Bush, you could say Iraq was a major strategic mistake, looking back on it. And to Trump, other mistakes like pulling out of TPP. We have created vacuums which countries that are in many ways equal to us, like Russia. I agree Russia is a gas station in search of a country, but it plays pretty big on the world stage. Russia and China have filled. And in the case of backing out of TPP, we created a vacuum for China. Failure to join that Asian infrastructure bank, another opportunity for China. In the case of Russia, Obama's mistake not bombing in Syria gave Russia the ability to claim it had removed the chemical weapons when in fact it became an ally of Assad, who has continued to use the chemical weapons. And just one final point. The new war theater is cyber. And you don't need armies for that. You need ingenuity and enormous flexibility, and we haven't been as good at that as we need to be. The threat is, and from many places, including rogue actors, is enormous.
Jim, can you do it? Can you deal also with one question, which is how much is this because, on one hand, how much is it to be blamed on politicians in the West not being able to deal with things, and how much is it to do with the problems just getting much harder? So I was thinking, when you ran NATO, many of these things were not.
I think it is very much the latter, John. And to Mac's point about acceleration, I'm going to add to it transparency. Those are the two defining qualities, I think, of this era we're emerging in. And they multiply the degree of difficulty that any politician has to address. I want to pick up Jane's point. That's what I was going to mention. I think the panel's done a nice job being very geographic, but only cyber, goes from the highest level of our national security, the potential for someone to come after the electric grid, to go after our medical systems, our transportation systems, all the way down to the most intimate details of our lives. I'd invite you to think about what is on that supercomputer you carry around in your pocket or your purse. Cyber is infinitely broad, and the threat surface, because of the number of devices accelerating, proliferating, and creating transparency, will increase that degree of difficulty. And by the way, if that's not enough to worry about, there's one other non-geographic and beyond cyber thing we ought to keep in mind, and that is what happened exactly 100 years ago in 1918. Spanish influenza, Spanish flu, a pandemic which infected 40% of the world's population with a 20% mortality rate. Think about that. Are we ready for that? Not so much. I think we're probably more ready for the geographic threats, somewhat ready for the cyber, and we're nowhere on being prepared for a highly predictable pandemic.
Peter.
I think we are literally in the foothills of our cyber awakening.
Yep.
It's too big an issue to open up a discussion about now. We just have to be just so aware that as the Internet of Things develops, emerges, and takes over our lives, we don't do idiotic things like plug our fridges into the Internet. We've got to keep as much as we can almost away from the Internet in order to secure our own homes. That's a sort of simplistic statement. I'm sorry, I wanted to say something about Iran, if I may.
Yes.
Jane mentioned this. I referred to it in my initial remarks. Why do I think this is so important? Don't have to state the obvious about Iran's nuclear capability. But it raises bigger, almost sort of existential issues about the conduct of international relations, about the ability of the West, of the United States and Europe, to arrive at a view, to negotiate together, to knock a deal out and then to stick by it. And I think that we cannot create a situation where, having gone so far to create this deal and put it into place and to sign on the dotted line, that the President of the United States can just wake up one day and say, well, no, this is not a deal I like anymore. This carries immense dangers. Not only does it, will make people and actors like Iran question whether there is such a thing as an international deal to be made with the West that the West will stick by. Secondly, it will make many people in Europe worry about the health and cohesion of the transatlantic alliance, what American leadership means and where it will take us in the future if they can knock a deal like this into touch in the way that he seems to be envisaging. Thirdly, it will make people in Europe worry about sanctions policy, a really important sort of tool and instrument for us to use in international relations, in taking on those who want to flout the rules and law. Sanctions are a very important instrument in our toolkit, and it will be harder to agree collectively on the use and deployment of sanctions if the president chooses simply to ride a coach and horses through the Iranian deal. I know there are issues to do with the ballistic missiles, the sunset clause, Iran's regional role, not least, but not only what it's doing in Syria, but I hope he thinks twice, three times before simply tossing the deal aside. It has big ramifications.
I address this question to you and maybe Carlos, but really to all of you. Do you think statesmanship, whenever we look at these problems, whenever we examine it, people come back at some point, and you've all mentioned it in different ways, to the issue of leadership. You read books like Kissinger's most recent one, and he goes back again to the idea that nowadays, to be a statesman like Metternich or previous people who are able to guide foreign policy. You think of Kissinger going to China and doing that quietly. That sort of diplomacy is now very difficult, and by the same token, as you all said earlier, Congressman particularly, now politicians are judged within seconds on particular issues. You have no time to, if you make a gaffe, you're in trouble immediately. Yeah. That is actually much more difficult. You've all served in public life in different ways.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. It's very, very close. I was just at the Boao conference on Hainan, and President Xi spoke for about 45 minutes, and everyone was expecting at least a sentence that would say, we don't want a trade war, but if the U.S. wants one, we'll have to engage. And he gave a 45-minute speech and did not mention the U.S., did not mention a trade war. So the first reaction was, we've heard this before. He didn't say anything. But after people thought about it, that whole room was incredibly impressed. What a statesman. He didn't have to say, I'm tough. He didn't have to say, I'm powerful. He talked about the future of China. And just to the point of statesmen and how role models are changing and how diplomacy takes place and who we used to think was a role model. And what I have been hearing and reading over the last 2 days is how impressed the world is by Kim Jong-un and the way he has managed this South Korea thing. It's like, my gosh, we didn't know he was as sophisticated as he was. Unbelievable the way he has shifted his image to a man who is smiley, he is confident, he is, he's in the game, and I find that very interesting.
But I was in Bao, and I also, like many journalists, I followed Kim Jong-un. It is a fundamentally different regime. Xi Jinping's pageantry in which he was introduced, no Western leader would get away with that. By the same token, on the way that Kim has operated, there is perhaps a slightly less hostile press in North Korea than there is in...
Well, but I mean, around the Western world, I was just shocked the way he walked up to that border and with the self-confidence, like he had done it 50,000 times before. And we know he hasn't.
And then go to the Congress.
Which agency was working for him exactly?
I don't know, but I'd say he did.
Where were we? I don't know.
I would just add to this, though, and something we haven't mentioned, which is the advent of social media and the use of it, the adroit use of it by our own president, apparently by Kim Jong-un to a certain extent, and by others around the world, and the boombox that it creates and the way ideas ricochet off into silos that different people look at. And there is no more Walter Cronkite, and that's the way it is. There's nobody like that, no one validator in the world. So those leaders, if you call them leaders, those important personages who can manage that, it seems to me, give themselves huge advantage. Again, it's a new geopolitics, but it is on steroids because of social media.
I just want to add something to the topic of technology. We talk about cyber. I think the real disruptor is digital technologies. And I don't think we understand how big the change will be and how fast it will be, a lot faster than the last 50 years. And we could be talking about millions and millions of people out of work. That is national security as well.
Jim, and then we'll get to the...
I just want to actually hit the bell on Kim Jong-un for 1 second and just make sure we're remembering collectively who he really is. He has 5 million people in concentration camps that make what happened in Europe in the Holocaust look relatively benign. And this is a rich, detailed literature, book after book, report after report. We are very focused on getting rid of those nuclear weapons. At some point, what happens to all those millions in these camps?
Not only that, we want to meet with him in 3 weeks. We're giving him the importance of President Xi.
Right, exactly. So we ought to just remember he murdered his brother, murdered his uncle, used an artillery gun to execute his family members. We need to sort of step back, and to Mac and Jane's point, the cycle that drives us forward. Suddenly he's this charming, pudgy, pleasant guy with a slightly goofy haircut. This guy is a monster, and we ought to realize that.
He's a talented monster.
Sure. Issue of leadership at this precise moment.
And I think it really goes to the heart of matter. So think not only about this, but also about how the Russians were trying to manipulate us, taking both sides of controversial issues. Before and after our presidential election, they paid for Facebook ads for gun control and Facebook ads against gun control. So you think about how easily manipulated we can be. What's the antidote to that? It's having context. And it's also understanding, having a historical perspective. And if I have one major indictment of political leadership over the past several decades, including myself, by the way, it is that we have not paid enough attention to reminding and educating Americans to what a unique place this is, and especially to the liberal international order, which we helped build with our allies after World War II, and how we as Americans benefit from that in our everyday life. That's a big part of the antidote to a tendency towards isolationism, and we have not done that. We've taken it for granted.
How do you think you can do that? Just to...
You have to start step by step, and what you'll deal with is all of what we've just been talking about. These social media instant impressions about, oh, he seems like a good guy after all. The only anecdote I know is historical context, and obviously that starts with education system and a whole variety of things. But back to your question of leadership, it's part of my job when I'm talking with my constituents or others to help remind them where we've come from, what it took, and then some of the challenges.
Do you think a Winston Churchill or a Teddy Roosevelt could be a leader today? Could they survive in Congress?
They were defined by their age, but someone with many of Churchill's characteristics could absolutely be a leader today, and would help, I think.
And she would be terrific. On the wall of the House chamber is I guess it's the eagle, and it says "E pluribus unum." And Bill Cohen, former Defense Secretary in the United States and former member of Congress, said, sadly, we're in an era of "E unum pluribus." And it's not a good pluribus. It's a bunch of people railing
not good
against
Latin
each
either.
other.
If I could just jump in one thing, I think the characteristic of any leader needs to be, one of them is to believe in something bigger than yourself. It can't be all about you. And I worry about a world where everyone's policy is, I believe in my country, and that's it.
Okay, on leaders, I agree completely with Secretary Gutierrez. The other thing that to me defines leaders is dealing in hope, not in fear. That's what Churchill and Roosevelt had in common. They were dealers in hope.
Yeah.
And that is the quality that we are somewhat lacking in some of our leaders who want to frighten us instead of leading us with hope.
That is true, but neither Churchill nor Teddy Roosevelt had to deal with public opinion of the sort on the scale so driven by social media in the way that our leaders have to deal with it today. You know, the Congressman used the three magic words: liberal international order. We've got to realize that we are conducting policy in an environment in which our public really only believe in one of those words, and it's neither liberal or international. And so when we're guiding or leading and persuading public opinion to follow us in difficult policies, we've got to realize that politics is just so much more complex and driven now. It's when I talk to business leaders about political risk and things, I say, look, let's not talk about who's up and who's down and who's in, who's out. Go below the surface. Look where public opinion is heading. And when we look at where public opinion is heading and where it's traveled over the last 10 years, this should give us huge cause for, yes, concern, but also realize that as public officials, we have a huge challenge on our hands to reshape public opinion and to take it with us, because if we don't, then there'll be no Churchills or Roosevelts succeeding in the way that they did in their era.
I would end on that point, except we have all agreed that hope is more important than fear. So I'm going to ask the chair of the Armed Services Committee to give us one reason for hope to end this panel, and then we will stop.
The greatest force for good in the world today is a strong American military that provides a stabling force. It is still the strongest military in the world, and thanks to the actions of Congress a couple months ago, we have gotten again, after a long absence, a bipartisan agreement to begin to rebuild that military. It does not answer all our questions, and a military is not the only tool, but the other tools are more effective if you have that basic strength, and we are starting to remember that and actually achieve it.
Well, we should pay tribute to members of the military who are here in the hall in front of you. But I would like to thank We should also pay tribute to our panel. I'm not entirely sure we pushed hope above fear, but we did give a very good reason, a series of reasons why, sadly, risk at the moment seems to be something that is somewhat endless. But thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.